Welcome to day two. Today we will talk about journal articles. So then the mystery of what is this thing, a journal article, can now be revealed to you. Now you're so excited, so excited. All right, so we'll talk about what is a scientific article or a journal article. We'll talk a little bit about ethics in publishing, which is surprisingly a thing. Where do you find journal articles? We're going to talk about that just a titch today, but we'll spend some time learning how to find them next week. Then I'm going to do a little demonstration on the parts of the article and reading an article. And we'll talk a little bit about what is a smackdown. It's really my own term, unique to this class. A smackdown is really what I'm saying, instead of saying research critique, because I just think it's more fun and I believe in fun. Okay. So first off, why do we even need informed consumers? So let's talk about this idea of what's an informed consumer. If you are talking about or reading research, well, then you are a consumer. Whether or not you are an informed consumer is the issue. And you can see the advantages to being an informed consumer as opposed to somebody who doesn't know how to evaluate the information that they're getting. So informed consumers can evaluate the information. Like we said yesterday, critical thinking. Critical thinking is a thing. So you want to be able to evaluate research. Lots of people use research and they will back their position up with research. Well, we hope that they will. Some of them don't. But if they do, then you can look at the kind of research they use to back up what they're saying and decide if it supports what they're saying or not, if it's good research or not. So you need to know some things to evaluate research. Looking forward toward your eventual work. You may get a job in the psychology industry. And if you do, then people will make decisions, hopefully based on information that comes from research. And you can determine whether or not those decisions make sense based on how you evaluate that research. So you don't have to become really, really good at this. You can, look at other people who are really, really good at evaluating research, but primarily you can know enough so that you can be somewhat informed and be an informed consumer. If you work for a company that says this is a policy we're going to do, and we're basing it on this article, and you look at the article and you think, gosh, this article doesn't make a lot of sense. I can use what I learned in my basic research methods, this class right here, to evaluate it, and I don't think it makes sense. Then you are a wonderful informed consumer and you can do a lot of good. Producers of research are the people that make the research, that do the studies, that run them. They're the ones who work in areas where they can do research. It's awfully hard to do research when it's just you. A lot of times you need a university structure to be able to do the research. And so that's why most research happens in these structures like the universities or large companies that can afford to create research or can pay people to do it. And so these people are the producers. Most of the rest of us are consumers. And if you're reading journal articles, you're a consumer. If you're reading or listening to the news or looking on Reddit or whatever, you're a consumer. And so you want to be able to use your critical thinking skills to evaluate what is being produced for you to consume. Okay. Ethics in reporting. We talked about ethics yesterday. We need some ethics in our reporting. And what this means is, of course, you want to report accurate things without bias. Now, this ship has kind of sailed with media these days. We know that they are not without bias, and the accuracy is often questionable. So you want to be a very informed consumer that way. It's hard because you have to look at a lot of different research and resources. Well, it's the same thing with psychologically or medically oriented data. You have to learn how do I report this? Or you have to learn what you need to report. So if you're running a research study and you start seeing that there are some results that are alarming, then you need to report those so people can take a look at what they're doing instead of just continuing on with the study. The Tuskegee study would have been a great example of that. It would have been ethical for the people who were doing the study to report their findings right away and then stop the trial if that was what was necessary. Clearly, that would have been necessary in the Tuskegee study. Here's an example, kind of this year, February of this year, an example of an ethical problem in reporting data. There was a study looking at the impact of stents on mortality and health in people. And what happened was, after a little bit of time, what was clear from the data was that there was some death involved with stents. Were they as effective as open heart surgery or not? And so the data showed that after 3 years, more people were dying with stents. And the people doing the study did not release this data. They continued just doing the study, even though they knew that having the stent procedure gave you a bigger chance of death. So this would be an ethical problem in terms of reporting data. So let's talk about what is a journal article. Okay, so plain language, right? Researchers write up their studies and they publish them. They write them up in a pretty clear format that is pretty widely accepted as there's one basic way to do things with some variations. So when they write them up, they're called articles. And then they publish them in things called journals. So journals are like magazines for nerds, right? I'm just going to stick with that definition. All right. And they publish them, and then you have what's called the literature. And so if someone says, well, go look in the literature, that might seem like a weird thing to say, but what they mean is the body of research that's out there. So it's huge. The literature, this is this huge body of research. Like, for example, right now there are close to 2 million articles per year in the literature. And these articles are published in nearly 30,000 journals. So there are a lot of things in the literature. So of course, if someone says the literature, you could say, you mean the psychological literature? Oh, okay, well then you probably mean, about 2,300 journals with all kinds of articles per year there. And so it's a lot of things. It's a vast amount. There's no way one person could keep up with all of the psychology literature, much less the general literature. You just have to specialize because there's so much information. Some of the information is really useful. A lot of the information is less useful. And some of it is because people needed stuff to study so that they could publish articles so that they could get promoted. There's so much out there that's about what it is. There's a whole bunch of research that are people's areas of interest. They're like, this is really cool. I want to read more about this. And so I'm going to research this, and we will publish all kinds of articles about this area. Well, that's valuable because the person has specialized interest in this area, and so that's what they want to do, and they probably know a lot about it. Probably a little more reliable than, gosh, I just need a promotion. Can you just publish something, anything? I don't know, get my name on a paper. I've witnessed both of those things, like in person. And I can tell you, they're both a thing. Okay, anyway, we're going to talk about what a basic journal article looks like, and go through kind of the basic accepted format. So when you're looking for empirical data, in other words, scientific data, in other words, the research, when you're looking for the research, there are lots of places you can find it. It might be published articles, published books, published databases. The public can access them, or they're reasonably accessible for, researchers or whatever. They're reasonably accessible. Then there are published articles, books, and databases. They're not acceptable. Generally we think of they're not accessible to the average person. They may be in a library, they may be published, but not widely spread out, not widely available, that sort of thing. Then there's something called gray data. Gray data is the data that's back in your file in the back room that you never published. So nobody knows about it, but it's there. We call it gray data. And then there's data that's not easily available to the public. Usually it's a company that might run a study and then they put that data in their back files in the file cabinet in a locked room, and they say, wow, we don't want that data getting out because it doesn't look good for us. One example is Prozac. Prozac is an antidepressant, and there are a whole bunch of studies that the pharmacological company ran looking at the value, the efficacy, the effectiveness of Prozac. And a lot of these were not available. They were not accessible to the public. The company had them, but the company was keeping hold of them. You couldn't get them. And so there's a researcher named Irvin Kirsch. He works in Connecticut, University of Connecticut, and he used the Freedom of Information Act to require that the drug company release those results, release those studies that had not been published. And so he was able to demonstrate that the effect of Prozac is much less impressive than it seemed. Published data showed it was impressive when you added all the studies that they did that they didn't publish, and you look at all the data, it was much less impressive than with just the few studies that they kind of cherry picked to show that it was good. This is not uncommon. And so you just have to know that there's a lot of data out there you probably don't have access to. So what is there? We're always skeptical, right? You just stay skeptical all the time. Next question to ask when you're looking at a journal is it a good journal? Because there are really bad journals that exist. So how do you know? Well, here are a few things that you can look at to give you an indication. But again, none of these are for sure answers. None of them are. You can still have a really bad article in a really good journal. In fact, for my doctorate, we did these things called qualifying exams. And our qualifying exam for research methodology, you asked us to look at an article, basically doing a big smackdown of this article. And so you looked at the article and figured out all the things that might be wrong with it. And I remember reading through this article and just kind of unpacking more and more and more and thinking, holy cow, this article's horrible. And then I asked the professor after the qualifying exam was over, I said, I was just curious, it seems like was that published in a really reputable journal? Because I was kind of having this suspicion it was, because he was just the kind of guy who would do that to really make you question. And yet, for sure, it was published in one of the top journals in the field. And so the thing I learned from that was, even though it's a top journal, you still have to have your skills for being able to evaluate research. You can't just trust that since it was in a good journal, that means it's good. A lot of things are in good journals that they're not good. So is the journal good? That is one factor to examine when you're trying to figure out if the article that you're reading makes sense when you're evaluating. Sometimes some journals might publish really great articles that are not really great journals. So again, it's not a for sure thing, but it kind of helps to build up evidence on one side or on another. So the first thing you look at is you want to make sure that the journal is peer reviewed. What peer reviewed means is that you have an article, say you're an author and you have an article and you want to publish it in this journal. So you send it to the journal. Well, the journal will send that article to about 2 or 3 maybe reviewers, 2 or 3 reviewers who are have some expertise in the subject that you're writing in. So like if you write an article about butterflies, they're not going to send it to scientists who work with mercury, right? Because they don't know anything about butterflies, probably. So it's peer reviewed, meaning reviewed by people who know something about the work you're doing, peers in your field. And the peers those reviewers will look at that article and examine the methodology, the design, the writing, all of those things. And then they will send you back kind of their smackdown, their critique of your article. So I've been on both sides of that. I've been on the side of the person who's the author, who's writing the article and sending it to the journals. And then I've been on the side where I'm the reviewer and I'm reviewing the journals, or not the journals, sorry, I'm reviewing the articles and critiquing them and making suggestions. And the kinds of articles I've seen have been a big range, from the worst, which would be people that you think they used Google Translate to translate their article into English, and they didn't do anything else. And their English is just awful, and they needed to hire somebody to help them. If you're publishing in an English journal, of course, your English has to be good. And their design was horrible, or there were huge sections of the literature that they left out and they didn't consider. So it varies. Or I've reviewed articles that are fantastic. I think, well, this is a great article. Yeah, maybe there's one or two things. There's always a couple things you catch when you're the reviewer. So peer-reviewed is important because that kind of gives a sense that the rest or some of the other people in that same field agree this article is worthwhile and should be published. That's what peer-reviewed means. Indexed. Indexed means that it's included in a big index. So there's the index of PsycInfo. PsycInfo you can find at the Von Cannon Library in their database section. If you look under the psychology subsection of databases, then up will pop this search engine or this index called PsycInfo. And you can use that. The journals that PsycInfo includes are going to generally be good journals. Certainly not predatory journals, and we'll talk about that in a second. And so PsycInfo is a type of indexing service. Medline is another. There's a bunch of them out there. And those are the PsycInfo and Medline are probably pretty relevant to you as psychology majors. The impact factor is something else to consider when you're looking at a journal. Impact factor means that the information or the articles, the research in there is having an effect, an impact on the scientific community. The way they measure this impact is how many people are citing these articles, how many people are saying, hey, I found this and here's the reference. So if your article gets cited a bunch of times, then you're having a bigger impact on the literature than if your article gets cited like 1 or 0 times, in which case you're having pretty much no impact on the literature. So you can look up the impact factor of a journal. The thing also, this makes it a little more complicated. Impact factor is not the best way to measure the actual usefulness of a journal, because the impact factor varies depending on the field and depending on the subfield. In some fields, a journal a journal with an impact factor of say 4, some areas that's really good, and in some areas that's just kind of mediocre. So it just depends on the area of the journal. So you can't say 4 is always good, and you can't say an 8 is not as good, because an 8 might be out of the ability of any journal in that field to do, and a 3 might be great in that field. So you have to weigh that based on what is available. But you can look up the impact factor, and it does give you some idea. So you can look up all these things, find the journal's homepage. We're going to look at an article from BMC Medical Education. You can look up their homepage. Just Google BMC Medical Education about, or something like that, and see if it's peer-reviewed. It'll say there somewhere. Sometimes it's hard to find on that website. You can find its impact factor. You can see if is it from a reputable publishing house or not. That's not always a sure thing. You can have some good journals that maybe are independent, maybe are not part of a reputable publishing house. Little less usual though. Most journals are part of a publisher, like Elsevier is a publishing house, or Springer, or Wiley, those sorts of things. So in some, even the best journals can publish poor articles. It's not a guarantee. It's an indication. I would feel much more comfortable, but it's not a guarantee. You still have to be using the critical thinking that you're going to learn here. Here is an example of impact factors. So I just looked this up using Google and searching for impact factors or journals ranked by impact factor for psychology. And so what we see is the Annual Review of Psychology is the journal that has the highest impact factor. So that's pretty great, 12.7. That's a big impact factor. Psychological Bulletin or PsychBull also has a very high impact factor. Psych Review has a pretty good impact factor. If you're looking at the top few journals in psychology, you can see that this is about where their impact factor is. But you look at the top two, 12.7 and 9.3 essentially, then you're seeing a big difference between number 7, that's a 5. And so you can see there's a range here in terms of impact factor. You know, when people read it, people cite it. If it's available, people are going to read it more. So you can see impact factor is not all about quality. A lot of it is about what's available, what people are reading, maybe what is provided to them at most easily, and then they cite those articles, right? So you can see it's not the best way to evaluate quality. Predatory journals, let me just give you a little note about them. You may not run into them, but you might. These are journals that are basically out to get money from the people who are publishing. It's a pay-to-play journal. Not all pay-to-play journals are predatory. So that's important to realize. A lot of journals that are okay ask you to pay in order to get published. The journals that are good generally don't have to ask you to pay. They will publish what you have, and then that becomes part of how they get advertising. They also might be, you have to pay to read. And so that's a whole other issue on the other side. So usually if you have to pay to play, pay to publish, then you don't really have to pay to read it. A lot of times those are open access journals. And so their model is, we want everyone to read these things, so we're not going to ask people to pay in order to read. Instead, we're going to ask you to pay in order to be published. So lots of different ways of doing it, and some result in more or less quality. But predatory journals always want you to pay, because that's their whole thing, is you pay them in order to publish your stuff. You can pay thousands of dollars to get an article published. And if you need articles published so that you can get a promotion and that results in a lot more money, you can see where people might resort to this if they can't get published elsewhere. So predatory journals claim to provide peer review, but they sometimes often don't. And so they lie on their websites. They will lie about how they're affiliated with these scholarly organizations, or they will name scholars to their editorial boards without telling them, right? And so one day you're traveling the internet and you're like, wait, why am I listed as on the editorial board of this journal I've never heard of? It's because they've stolen your identity to make themselves look better. So anyway, lots of lying involved. Predatory journals are generally not indexed by indexing services because they know that they're corrupt. You can get a list, you have to pay for it though, which makes me laugh. You have to pay for the list of bad journals, but it's out there. All right, here we go. Parts of a journal article. Let's look at a bit. I'm going to show you an example of a journal article. I try to select something that you could read without using a dictionary. There's a lot of journals out there that you need a dictionary to read, but this one seemed pretty reasonable. And then we'll kind of look at how that article is constructed. What are all the parts of it? So this is step 1 in taking the mystery out of the journal article and helping you read things in a way where you feel a little bit more confident about what's going on. So if you look at Lab 7, Lab 7 talks about what are the parts of a journal article. So you should have a good sense of what those are now. You have the introduction, the methods, which tells you how you did the study, the results, which is what you got, and the discussion is, well, what does it mean? And then references, which is, this is what all the other people said that I used to support my thinking in this article. So the introduction will tell you why I'm doing this, what it's about, what are my thoughts, what are my hypotheses. The methods will say, this is how I did it. These are the people involved. This is what we did. This is what the tests are that we use to measure them. This is how we analyzed it. The results say, okay, we analyzed it and here's what we found. The discussion is, okay, what we found, here's what it means. Here are some of the things that might be good, might be bad. Here's the ways in which it worked, it didn't work, and the references. So not all articles look just like this, but the basic parts are still generally there for your basic journal article. You can have different kinds of articles that don't really fit into this. For example, if you're just writing a review article, you're not doing a study. You're just writing an article about, these are all the things I found in the literature. And so that's really more like a really, really, really long introduction in a sense. But it wouldn't have methods and results because there was no study that actually happened. It's just an article that is sort of more like a book review. Okay, so they won't always look exactly like that depending on the kind of article that they are, but most of them will look like this. So here is your example. Now I put this URL in your Word, in your thing for today. Yeah, your thing. And so you should have opened up this website before listening to the lecture. If not, you can just pause and go grab the website. And right there in front of you will be this article. And you can read through it, or you can just look at the screenshots that I've tried to take here. So this is randomized controlled trial. Now, randomized controlled trial is a type of research design. We're going to talk about those in a couple days. It's a type of research design. What they're looking at, how did this thing called well-being therapy work in terms of helping people with adaptation and emotional distress? And the people they're talking about were medical freshmen. So even in the title, you can see a fair amount about what the study is about. The next thing you see is the abstract. Abstracts, just like articles, abstracts can have different styles. Some abstracts are just one paragraph. Some abstracts are like this, where they're broken down into pieces and they explain different parts of the study, all in the abstract. And so they all give an overview of the article, like a big summary. It's just that some of them are one paragraph and some of them are like this, broken down. So here you've got the abstract. It kind of breaks down all the different sections of the article. You've got the background or the introduction, same basic idea. You have the methods, how they did the study. You have the results. Conclusions is sort of like discussion. And here they added in the trial registration number. Trial registrations are a thing that people are trying to get to happen all the time. Not everyone's compliant with this, but the idea is that we want to organize the community. And so if you're going to run a clinical trial, we want you to register it. And the registration does two things. First of all, it alerts the community to, hey, I'm going to do this study. And secondly, it kind of keeps you honest because you say, this is what the study is. Here's my plan. Here's what I'm going to do in terms of analyses. Great. And so now it's down, it's written down. So you can't go back on that later and pretend that you weren't going to look at that thing, but you were going to look at the other thing that you got results for. So it keeps people honest also. And anyway, so they give their trial registration number. The next thing you see right below the abstract is the introduction. Here they're calling it background, but it's basically the introduction. It's pretty much the same thing. You see in blue these numbers. The blue numbers represent in-text citations in this style. This is not APA style. So you're not going to do this when you write yours. You won't put in numbers. Instead, you put in names and dates, and we'll show you how to do this later. But just so you can see, they have in-text citations. What an in-text citation does is it backs up, it gives support for, it sort of says, here's the research that supports this. It backs up your ideas. And so that first sentence that says, it's well documented that maladjustment and emotional distress are extremely prevalent among college freshmen. Well, you can't just say that. You need some data to back you up. And so you have to cite a resource. Okay, cite, C-I-T-E, cite a resource. That's why it's called a citation. Okay, so you say, here's how I know this. Look, these people in number 1 reference said this. They did a study and it showed it. And so there, I've backed up my sentence here with this support. That's basically the purpose of an in-text citation. So every sentence that you write that is a fact, you can't say, well, yeah, this is just a fact and I know it. And so obviously, you have to back it up with some sort of source. So the background tells you about why they're doing the study. We'll break this down. You're in your lab manual. We'll talk about this later, but you could just check on it really right now if you wanted. Lab 51 tells you what are the elements you need in an introduction. So you need the problem of interest, So something is happening. Oh no, what can we do about it, right? You could say, trees are losing leaves really quickly. Oh no, what's the link between now and the past? Then you tell them. You summarize the relevant research. You shouldn't summarize the whole field. You can't do that. It's not interesting. And journals are really interested in more information, less space. So they want you to be succinct. They want you to be able to say things as briefly as possible. So the style of writing for a journal, medical writing or writing for a psychology journal, you have to be very succinct, not flowery, not long-winded. All of those things that maybe work for you in some other kind of essay aren't going to work for you in terms of scientific writing. You want to summarize the relevant past research. Then you want to describe the basic purpose of this study and describe your hypothesis. So if you wanted to pause, this would be really good learning for you. If you wanted to pause and take a look at the article that you have pulled up and see if you can identify these 5 things in that background. What is the problem? What's the link? What's some of the past research say? What's the basic purpose of this study? What's your hypothesis? Okay. Read through the whole entire background and see if you can identify all of these areas. And then unpause and we'll do it together. So in this introduction, we have a problem of interest, which you see in the first sentence. Maladjustment and emotional distress are prevalent among college freshmen. And it's even worse for medical school freshmen. That's basically what they're saying in the first paragraph. That's the problem that they're going to work on in their study. And that's how you start off when you write your introduction. You want to first start off with, here's the problem. And so you know you're doing it right. If you say, here's the problem, and somebody can say, oh no, right? That might be a little shortcut for you. Oh no, oh, that looks like a problem of interest. And then you have to link your problem to the research, to the literature. And in this, here to past research. What they found was that facilitating well-being might help reduce distress. It did this in an Italian study, maybe it'll help here, right? So that's a link to the research in the past. And then you want to summarize all of the past research on whatever is important to look at in your study. So in their study, they're saying, hey, we figured out that for maladjustment and emotional distress, it seems like something called adaptation helps. Adaptation helps, psychological well-being can be implemented. You can use this guy Fava's approach, and you can use that WBT, which is well-being therapy. You can use that approach, and that might help. And so this study, how is that relevant? Well, okay, now we're going to bring it down to using WBT for medical school freshmen. Will well-being therapy help medical school freshmen to have less distress and more adaptation? And that's their hypothesis. Okay, so that's the answer applied in this article to what are the elements of the introduction. If you do that on your own and try and figure it out, this will really help you understand journal articles much more quickly. So I would, it's not required, of course, there's no lab due with this part, but I would suggest that you practice. Part of that whole thing we talked about yesterday in terms of developing critical thinking skills, working outside of class, learning how to apply, etc. That is what this kind of work would be. If you go out and you find some journal articles and you practice doing this, that would be helpful. I would suggest going to just Google PubMed Central. If you Google PubMed Central, PUBMED Central, 3 different words, then you'll come up with full text articles, and you can just search interesting things to you there and just find what you can find. And if it looks complicated, go to the next one and just play around and see if you can break down an introduction so you can understand it. This will help you a lot when you go to write your own introduction. It will save you time. Okay, next thing we see in this article, if you scroll down a little bit in your article, here's a screenshot, you have methods. Now, in the methods, the basic categories are this. You should talk about the participants. You should talk about measures, what tests you use, what questionnaires, what measurement tools you used. You should talk about procedures, in other words, what you did. And you should talk about your statistical plan. So that would be how am I going to analyze this data? So that's what should be there. This article contains all those things. It adds a little bit more, which is actually kind of cool. It adds design. So that is very easy for the rest of us to be able to see exactly what their design was. It helps them because they're having to really talk about how they designed the study. And so it makes it more transparent. This is an element that I'm going to ask you to do when you write your research proposal. I want you to add in design for you. Not all articles include this, but it is nice when they do so that you can really see exactly what's going on. So their design is a 2-arm randomized controlled trial. So you've got 2 conditions, placebo and well-being therapy, 2 different conditions in your trial, in your study. And so what they did was they had people who were divided into 2 groups. One group got well-being therapy, the other group did not get well-being therapy. They got a placebo. And then they compared the groups to see what happened. If the people who got the actual well-being therapy did better than the people who only got the placebo. Okay, so it's a randomized controlled trial. You have 2 groups. Here are what the groups were. Okay. And then they talk about how people gave written informed consent, and it was approved by the ethics committee, which is just like the IRB, basically the same thing. And that's another important thing to make sure you put in any article that is written, that the subjects had informed consent and the study was approved by some sort of ethics committee or IRB. So this article has that section, the design, and then it has participants and recruitment. So recruitment usually is put into the participant section. Here they just added it to that bold header so that you could see that they're talking about participants and recruitment. It just makes it more clear. And I like it. The more clear, the better. You know, the less you have to try and figure out or assume. Sorry, just didn't need to move there yet. Here we are. Okay, then we had measures. What were the measures used? And here they detailed the different measures. I'll show you that in a second. And then they had the procedure. And when they looked at procedure, they told you more about the intervention. So they have subheadings for that as well. And so don't get confused looking at the subheadings and thinking that the subheadings mean the main headings, just as a note. So here in the measures, for example, you've got measures as this heading, and then you have a number of different measures. Well-being, how do they measure that? Okay, so they talk about that in that one paragraph as a subheading. And then you've got adaptation. How do they measure that? And so in some ways you could say one of the constructs or the things that they're looking at is well-being. How do they operationalize well-being? So I'm introducing this term now. We're going to talk about it later. But the idea of operationalizing is you're saying, how am I going to measure this? And so well-being was operationalized or measured using these scales, okay? And then adaptation, how was that operationalized? Well, we operationalized it as measured it with this validated adjustment scale. Right. Then we've got the procedure section, you can see there on the right, and they discuss what was the intervention. One thing that they did in the results section was they looked at how did the number of people that we got involved in the study, how did all that work out? You know, what happened to each person? So we've got 238 that were applying to become a participant. So they signed up for the study. But some of them didn't actually go beyond that. They didn't even fill out the screening questionnaires. So 32 of those never even filled out screenings. So they had 206 that basically they could start with. Unfortunately, 83 of those apparently didn't read the instructions. So they were not medical freshmen, so they couldn't use those. And so then they had 123 left that were freshmen that did fill out the screening questionnaires. Now, if they had some sort of treatment that would mean that they weren't naive subjects, they had already had some sort of well-being training, then you wouldn't want them in the study, because it's sort of like if you're doing a study of a treatment and the person's already done the treatment, then you're not going to get great results by having that person in your group, in your study. For example, let's say that person was randomized to the placebo group, but they had had the treatment already. They're not a true placebo, right? And so that would mean that your study had an internal validity problem. So I'm introducing some of these terms to you. We're going to go over them later throughout the next few weeks, but this way you kind of get a beginning familiarity with them. All right, so you had to eliminate some of these participants because say an exclusionary criteria was that you could have no other well-being or psychological training. So you had to be naive to that. So that would be an exclusionary criteria. Or maybe you were planning on entering therapy. So then they would say, well, you really can't be in this study and be in therapy because it's going to interfere with what we're doing. It'll make it messy. So they excluded those people. And what was left were 101 people. 101 people met all of the inclusion criteria. Then they randomized. So they found some way to provide random selection. Usually you do this with a computer program. So half of them went to the control group and half of them went to well-being therapy. And so the idea is that both of these groups were equal at the beginning in terms of all of their characteristics. They were basically looking the same basic gender makeup, age makeup, psychological distress at the beginning would have been the same. All of those things should have been the same, so that the only thing that really made the difference would have been the intervention. Okay, so they're using a control group. They're controlling for everything else except for the intervention. And then you can see some of them dropped out. And so then what they were left with at the end were 48 for the control group and 39 for the well-being therapy. And so then you get a sense of what happened to all of the subjects throughout the study. This is very helpful in terms of analyzing what might have gone wrong and making some judgments about are they including people in the study that it doesn't make sense to include, or they're getting rid of people for convenience so their results look better, et cetera. And so here you can just see a very clean, very nice graph that shows you exactly what happened. That's lovely. Okay, next section in the results. So of course that graph was part of the paper so that you could understand what happened to subjects or participants as you went through the study. The results analyzes what the statistics, what the data showed. They list what the statistics were and what the statistical analyses showed in results. So you can have descriptive statistics and inferential statistics. So the descriptive statistics describe the people in the study. And then the inferential statistics will look at the difference between the groups, essentially. And so that's what you see here in results. And they give you some tables and they talk about all the statistical information. The results section is usually the hardest section for anyone to understand until you've had not even just basic statistics. Basic statistics will help. But once you've had really great statistical training, then this section becomes much more easy to read. The problem is that statistics is becoming more and more high tech all along, and people who do statistics for a living have a lot higher understanding of what is going on than the average, even the average graduate student or the average person who's doing statistics in another area. So statistics can become fairly specialized. So what I'm saying is don't worry when this section looks like you're reading Greek. Don't worry about that. What they do is they will discuss what that all means in the discussion. And so they will tell you what the statistics, what the results section means, they will tell you in the discussion. The only reason you would want to know what all of those statistics are is to just check them to make sure that they did it right, or that they're being honest about what their results were. And so if you think that they did it right and they're being honest, in other words, you're trusting the peer reviewers that they did a good job, which, you could do, but I know there are some reviewers that skip this part or that just don't do a really good job. Maybe they don't understand it either and they just don't want to admit it, whatever. You can't always trust that it's perfect. So for you, in your case, don't stress about this. Read the discussion. The discussion will tell you basically what the results mean. And then last of all, you have a reference section. So in your papers, this would be a separate page and it would say references. You use other things in other area. Okay, that was vague. You use other titles, other ways of describing them when you use other styles of writing. So for example, MLA would be a different style, and you might say sources, or you might say bibliography if you're writing a book. Here, what we need are a list of references, and the references should have been used in the article. So it's not a bibliography. It is, here's the list of all of the sources we used to back up what we said. Here's this list. And you write the references in the APA style. These references here in this article, this whole article is not APA style, but it's a great example of an article. Okay, finally, let's apply this to our smackdowns. We're going to do this the last week of class, but we'll do like a little bit here and there until then. So I'm introducing you to what a journal article is, and I'm sort of folding in this idea of critiquing the article into it. So just because it's a good journal doesn't mean it's a good article. Do you understand what the article said? This is part of your job when you do an article smackdown, is I want to make sure that you understood the article, because otherwise what are we doing here, right? Like, part of the idea is that you learn how to understand articles. You want to be able to assess if the introduction did its job. So yeah, you'll do this and you'll do it using that same kind of pattern that we just talked about with discussing the problem, relating the problem to past research, etc., like in Lab 51. Was it designed well? This is a lot of what we're going to look at. We're going to look at what is the design. Can you pick it out? Can you figure it out? Can you see how they handled any threats to internal and external validity? In other words, did it work? And it's okay not to understand what I'm really talking about when I say internal and external validity, because we're going to work on this. This takes time to figure out, and it takes some thinking. You have to really be not really creative, but you have to be thoughtful when you read through these articles. The answers aren't like there in small print. So it's not like you just read through and count how many D's there are in the words. It's not like that. This is about thinking outside the box a little bit and learning how to become critical thinkers. And so it's a skill. It doesn't just come out of the sky. If you're not good at it now, don't worry. You will gain practice, gain knowledge, will gain skill in this area. And then one good thing to know would be, do the results actually match the conclusions that they reach in the discussion? This is not something that you can really worry about right now, because you need more work in statistics to be able to figure this out. So just let that go, but know in your mind that that is part of being able to critique an article. All right, that's it for today. Next time we will talk about chapter 1 and the scientific method. So until then, hope your day is beautiful. Talk to you later.